Welcome to the Cycle World podcast. Welcome back. If you're a repeat listener, we thank you for that. Share this podcast with your friends if you think they would like it. Helps us tremendously. The more people who listen, we want to share the wonders of motorcycling with as many people as possible. And Kevin Cameron, of course, our technical editor for Cycle World, and I'm Mark Hoyer, the editor-in-chief. We've seen a lot of stuff and got to do a lot of neat things, and we love talking about motorcycles. We're coming up on our 100th episode. This episode is Honda saw the future, and the future was RPM, making power with revs. And Mr. Honda went to the Isle of Man and came back with a few bikes, and they were, as Kevin was just telling me, fiddle-futzing around with some single-cylinder stuff. They were messing with some two-strokes. They built another single, the little single that kind of powered them into profitability.
1958.
And then we did a podcast on that. Yes, and then on the Cub, go check it out. Then they started making ripping 250cc 6-cylinders and 20,000 RPM, and Honda became the massive global powerhouse. Well, it was on its way in any case. So that's what we're talking about here, and principally the birth of the twins that fueled so much kind of middleweight growth. We had 350s as fast as British 650s, and really they came to define what a Honda motorcycle was meant to look like. They changed from something that they had borrowed and massaged to their liking, and then away they went building just Japanese motorcycles, and my did we learn to love them. So set us on course, Kevin. Get us down the road. Release the clutch.
Well, there were at one point, say 1950, 52, around 200 little outfits trying to make motorcycles in Japan. And the reason that there were so many was because Japan is sort of it's a string of islands, and manufactures in particular markets. But nobody had created an organization that could serve the entire nation. And what everybody was building was single-cylinder bikes. Some were building two-strokes. Honda started out that way. Mr. Honda, when the war ended, of course, Japan was in ruins. People needed to get somewhere. Among the things that were ruined were streetcars and buses. And therefore, bicycle extended the range of a person to how far they could pedal. But if you put a little motor on a bicycle, you could go a lot farther. For example,
thank goodness,
looking for something to eat. So,
and we're doing that now. We're doing that now with these e-bikes, because e-bikes have really expanded the two wheels in a motor market, and the pedal boosting makes you feel like amazingly wonderful. And then we're seeing an explosion in sort of miniature electric motorcycles, little dirt bike.
In Japan, motor-assisted bicycles were called pon-pons. And to get into the market, Mr. Honda created, first of all, his rather grandly named, what was it? It was a technical institute. It was a technical research institute, and he and a group of associates, you couldn't call them employees yet, it was sort of a little premature for that, bid on a lot of 500 Tohatsu manufactured generator engines for military radio transmission. And these things weren't terribly good. They could, however, be fairly quickly adapted to power a bicycle. And Mr. Honda made some improvements. Now, the thing about Mr. Honda is that people tend to think of him as a sort of practical madman when he wasn't throwing waiters who failed to satisfy his requirements through the window or wearing overalls to a fancy dress gathering, that he was throwing cylinder heads and shouting at people and making things happen in a big way. But in fact, he had quite sophisticated knowledge because he was one of those people who took up information like a sponge. So they're looking at this Tohatsu generator engine, and Mr. Honda has made some improvements on it, and they decided they could do better. So they made Model A, which was their first actually manufactured their product. And parts that required any precision had to be ordered in from outfits that had the necessary machine tools. One of Mr. Honda's early decisions was, we're not going to mess with sand casting. Sand casting is a time-consuming process that is suited for small lots. Die casting he saw as the future. The die closes, the metal enters the die, the metal solidifies enough for the die to open, the cycle repeats. Clunk, 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 the castings drop onto the conveyor. Now, this showed that he understood that manufacturing cost controls the width of appeal of your product. If you can manufacture the product using large-scale methods that cut costs, your product can reach more buyers because it costs less. And he understood that. Around 1949, when Honda Motor Company was formed, he took on a partner, Takeo Fujisawa, who was a down-to-earth finance man and all-around practical person. And at some point in late 49, Fujisawa said to Honda, we must start making four-stroke engines because the engines we make sound like they're not running properly and make a terrible smell and smoke. Well, Honda was somewhat taken aback, even offended by this. I can engineer around those things. They're smokeless oils. They're things we can do. Never mind that. Fujisawa wanted four strokes. And that's how it turned out. Because by this time, Honda had learned that Fujisawa knew a lot of things that he didn't know. And that's an important thing for partners. Because if people are fighting each other, it becomes Lincoln's house divided against itself that cannot stand. So Mr. Honda ordered a new hire, a gentleman who had come on 1947, I think. Kiyoshi Kawashima, who would be the second president when Mr. Honda retired. Kawashima would become president. He was hired straight out of university. I want you, said Mr. Honda, to design a four-stroke engine of better performance than anywhere available in Japan. So he designed a pushrod and rocker overhead valve engine for a market that was mostly buying side valves. And it had much better power. If you trace the flow pattern of air entering a side valve, it has to make a number of right turns. And as the late Kenny Augustine, the airflow wizard, once said, you can make air go fast, you can make air go around corners, but you can't do both at the same time. So this engine was the E-type, and it was a considerable success because it made better power than the competition, and it was a better design and better made. Now, Mr. Honda understood that the machine tools that they actually owned in the company were worn out old junk. Because, as you can imagine, Japan was not producing many machine tools in the late 1940s. It takes time to tool up for stuff like that. And while they were improving the E-type and selling quite a few, and were able, on the basis of that success, to borrow money in business, having credit is of tremendous value, because if you spend your own money, you're limited to what you could save in your own pitiful unitary life. And so in 1954, he decided we need late model modern machine tools that are designed for high productivity. So he gets on the Stratocruiser at Tokyo Airport and Haneda at that time, and it's 4 28-cylinder 4360 engines went into their deep hum, and he was whisked away to America and then onward to Europe. And while he was there, he was considerably interested in racing, having, before the war, built a racing car powered by a Curtiss OX5 V8 engine, liquid cooled. He took in the Isle of Man TT races. And of course, he saw that these bikes were tremendously fast, that it was a fabulous contest, and that success in the Isle of Man meant success in the world. That appealed to him.
Yeah, that was the biggest race, right? Everybody showed up. Everybody brought their, yeah.
NSU, the German firm, had redesigned their race engines for 1954, and their Renmax 250 twin was making 39 horsepower at something like 12,000 revolutions. Now, Mr. Honda didn't need a pitch pipe to understand that something very different was going on with NSU than with, for example, the Manx Nortons that won the 500 class. And he realized that these little engines, 250s, were nearly as fast as the 500s by this time. They were creeping up there. And that appealed to him because he knew that he wasn't going to sell very many 500s in Japan. So then he went to Europe, he went to Germany, he went to Italy. In Germany, he bought an NSU Supermax. In Italy, he bought one of Mondial's production racer 125 singles. Then back to Japan. Now, it's all very well to be handed a sheet that says our engine develops thus and such. You can fold that sheet into a rocket and toss it across the room. It doesn't prove anything, but they put the Mondial on their own dynamometer, and it made 17 horsepower. Now, that was impressive. Now, the ingredients of horsepower, Mr. Honda knew, are displacement, how much air and fuel mixture the cylinder can hold, RPM, and the stroke averaged net combustion pressure. Well, stroke average net combustion pressure is referred to as BMEP, brake mean effective pressure, and it is a sort of amalgam of cylinder filling, compression ratio, and combustion efficiency. And that had already been improved by Norton, by the makers of British singles. BMEP for an unsupercharged engine had been raised to 200 psi, and it hasn't moved much from that point to today because the atmosphere has not become any more capable of blowing air into cylinders. And of course, displacement is a choice that the manufacturer makes. That left RPM. And both NSU and Mondial were principal exponents of making horsepower with RPM. This changed the outlook of Honda Motor Company because it was realized that they could build engines of remarkable power that weren't big and heavy. So it wasn't long after his return from overseas that they embarked on a twin, the Dream C70. Now, the Honda Dreams that I saw in my youth offended me because they looked like they'd come from an old movie. They had the flared fenders that had originated back in the 1930s, and they had leading link suspension in the front, which you imagine trying to give the front wheel a twist. What is going to resist it? Those two little links.
little dog bones, yeah.
Yeah. So that just looked wrong to me. And a year later, they came out with C71, which had 12-volt battery and electric start. Now, this was an obvious change that had been yearning to happen for years and years, but it was prevented from it by, well, what's wrong with starting it with your foot? What are you, man up? It's no problem. And I remember trying to start my 500 single. There was a whole drill you had to go through, pull the compression release, remove the cap from the oil tank, push the engine through numerous times with your foot until you saw.
People are getting thirsty. I will bring the Velocette up here.
Can't have that.
So what you do with the Velocette, starting a big single, is the oil feed. We everyone crimps on a clear hose on the oil feed to the rockers. And I can tell you that it takes 50 kicks. After it's been sitting, it takes 50 kicks to get oil to show up in that pitiful.
Took a lot. It took a lot on my bike. So this was simply accepted. Well, motorcycles don't have electric start because why would you go to all that trouble? Because it increases the attractiveness of your product. So from 1957, when the C70 and 71 appeared, until Harley Davidson, the bastion of manliness, adopted electric start in 1965, wasn't very long. And Mr. Fink, who guided me on a tour of Harley Davidson in the spring of 1966, said, "Everything Honda has done has increased our sales." So these twins were nearly ready for world domination, but some more changes were necessary. Honda produced their first CB, the B indicating a sports motorcycle, CB92. A long ago friend of mine had one, in 1963 or so. They were made in 1959 and for a couple of years thereafter. Such a cute little thing. And it was a twin, a 125 twin. And it had electric start that worked. Just press the button and you're running. No big process. Push the button and go. So they began to manufacture CB72 and CB77 twins that looked like bigger versions of CB92. They had electric start, 12-volt electrics, and instead of leading link horrors from the past, they had telescopic forks. Now, the humpback gas tank that was such a signature element of those early Hondas, the existing literature quotes Mr. Honda as saying that he stood for a long time in front of a statue of the Buddha in one of Japan's many temples. And his wife thought that he'd frozen up somehow, but he's standing there and looking. And he said, the shape of the lines on the side of the tank is the shape of the Buddha's eyebrow, the curve from his eyebrow down to his nose. Well, that's very Japanese. It wouldn't occur to me as a simile, but that was his story. When these bikes, CB72 and CB77, got to the US, they were not fully competitive with British twins, but they were very close. I remember having a Zoom across town behind a fellow on a Triumph 500 Daytona, and I was riding a 305 Honda, the CB77. It was close. And contact with the American market quickly did away with the flared fenders and the leading links and all of that the trappings of Honda's beginnings. And although people had claimed early on that Honda were copying NSU, copying Horrocks Imperator, which had a very similar, actually the Imperator engine looks very much like CB350, very much. But it was time passed. So Mr. Honda addressed this business, these critics. One set of critics was saying, Honda engines turn high revolution, so they wear out immediately. Don't buy them. Well, he said, if these engines are so poor, why are so many people buying them and then buying them again when a new model comes out? Could it be that they associate high RPM with failure because when they try to build for high RPM, they have failure? We know things that they don't. All this time, Honda had his people pushing those foreign-made machine tools harder and harder because production was rising steeply. And they had to discover ways of making that tooling reliable at higher piece rates. And finally, they got into it so deeply that they began to manufacture some of their own machine tools. So I look on CB350, which came out in 1968 and was produced until 72, I think, as an Americanized CB77. It had a sort of anonymous looking but pleasant enough gas tank shape. It had the telescopic fork and the twin shocks in the rear. The cylinders were vertical, like a British bike's cylinders, instead of sloping forward as on the earlier CBs. So another thing that interests me a lot about this succession of engines is that CB77, the 305 Honda, was about the same in cylinder filling as the CB350, and the two of them were somewhat behind in cylinder filling from the 1969 design that took over the world, CB750. So this concept of a two-valve cylinder with a single overhead cam working the valves through rockers was a basic design element which Honda used over and over until they adopted double overhead cams in the case of CB750F and subsequent. So this was their workhorse during the time of their most rapid expansion into markets. It didn't have those engines. None of those engines had 4 valves per cylinder. The racers had 4 valves per cylinder for a specific reason. In order to make a 50cc Honda 4-stroke beat the Suzuki 2-stroke 50cc GP bike, it had to turn nearly twice the RPM. And they found out how to do that. That was not copied from anyone because there's a long distance from NSU's 12,000 RPM and the Italian 125 singles 13,000 RPM to the 21,500 RPM of the 50cc twin that won the world championship in 1965.
Amazing.
So what was going on here? Another big element which Mr. Honda clearly understood because of things that he said at the time is these products must be designed for manufacturing. If we come up with a complicated design that requires a lot of tricky to make parts, and if their assembly calls for people with 3 arms and 8 fingers on each hand,
lots of shims and all that business.
Oh.
None of that stuff. We just bolt it together and away we
Yep.
go. That's what we need.
This was what I noticed when I first took apart a horizontally split Japanese-made engine, and it was a Honda, is that when you took the case halves apart, all the parts of the engine were laid out in front of you. Kickstart shaft, gearbox output, gearbox input, crankshaft.
Yeah, it's like a tray. It's wonderful.
Yes.
Like working on an RD, man. It's all right there. You just take off the top and then put all your bits in.
And
wonderful.
this thing, you could have the engine completely apart on the bench in under an hour. It was easy peasy. And that was done intentionally because if it comes apart easily, it assembles easily.
It never seems that way in real life, Kevin.
Well, in real life,
every time I take it apart,
you and I are close enough to our first experiences to remember that the first time you do anything is really complicated. And the second time you can't imagine how you thought so.
Yeah.
So this idea of designing the product so that it can easily be manufactured was something that was noticed by the original designer of Triumph's Speed Twin 500 of 1937, Edward Turner. Edward Turner went to Japan in 1960 and was given, so to speak, the keys to the city. He visited the manufacturers, and of course, he was appalled at what he saw because he saw fast-acting automatic machines making parts at a rate that could not be believed at home.
Well, I tell you, when you were talking about Honda investing in machines and building their own machines and making, we're gonna die cast, we're gonna do this fast, making all those commitments. I always go back to the Triumph film of the '50s, where the guy is sticking the frame in like a coal fire and hitting it with a hammer to straighten the frame out that they've brazed. They're brazing it together. It's just, it's wonderful. All that manufacturing stuff, Jaguar factory machining engines, Triumph factory machining engines, they just weren't making the same investments. And Edward Turner is there witnessing the future demise and not getting the companies. They had so many opportunities. The British had engines that they designed, and they were like, nah, we're just going to keep cranking these out, which is an easy trap to fall into if it's working.
Mr. Honda committed his company to buying $1 million worth of machine tools on that 1954 trip, and they were wondering how they're going to pay. And Mr. Fujisawa came to an understanding with banks. Look, we're going up like a rocket. It might not have been strictly true at that moment, but it soon became true. At one point, Mr. Honda was required MITI, the Ministry of Industry and Trade or something, international trade and industry. He's filling out these forms, and it says, what is your production per month? And he pulled a number out of the air, wrote down 300. Not long after, it was 500. So
it reminds me of that fib, the little fib angle reminds me of talking to Siddhartha Lal, who's in charge of Royal Enfield. He was given Royal Enfield back around 2000 or so, 1999. And he made it his job to bring Royal Enfield back from the brink. And he made all these plans and started modernizing. I interviewed him in India, riding the unit construction engine 500, the new engine. Was new manufacturing, all that stuff. So he had made the big changes from 1999, 2000 to 08, where they came out with the new engine that had the beat, it had the single cylinder, and but it had fuel injection, all that. Really a lot of progress. And he said, we just sat in this room at the factory, and he's a very chill person, obviously very driven and a good thinker and a good leader and all the things that make that company what it is now. But he said to me this list of things. He says, we have a brand you cannot buy off the shelf. We have a legacy that you cannot buy off the shelf. We have low-cost manufacturing. And we have, I think he said, plenty of cash. And so that really, all that stuff stuck with me. I put it in the story that I wrote about that bike. And then I saw him later in India. And I was recounting that quote to him. And I said, yeah, you said this, this, and this. And you said we had plenty of cash. And he's like, oh, and he started laughing. And he said, oh, I may have stretched it a little with that one. It was good stuff. We have plenty of cash. Maybe we didn't, but we were getting there. So it's good,
While all this technical stuff was going on in manufacturing and in design, Mr. Fujisawa was selling the product. He wanted to establish a dealer network around Japan and ultimately came up with 13,000 dealers. But he had to iron out some difficulties, such as delayed payments and lack of appropriate signed agreements and what have you. And he came up with procedures that made it possible to expedite receipt of income and showed Japanese riders that they could go to a Honda dealership and get a piston or a handlebar lever or any part that was needed for the motorcycle in a systematic way. Not, well, we only make those 3 times a year and we're coming up for the next batch, so I'll write your name on this card and I'll call you. No. Yes, we have that part in stock. How many would you like? So the 200 manufacturers, of course, steadily dwindled away. A similar situation existed in the U.S. in the early 1920s.
Oh, England
And
was legendary too for the massive variety of
yes,
manufacturers. Oh,
yes. And seems to me that at one point, Mr. Honda said, um, our best tool for taking over the market and becoming number one in the world, which was an early ambition of his. This wasn't something that came to him at 4 a.m. after they were making 500 a month. He said, we're going to cut price as our machine tool speed of operation makes possible. And I think in one of the later years, they put 10 competitors out of business on price because these other firms were not willing to fly northwest to the US and buy $1 million worth of machine tools. They were trying to make do.
it's that saying: the faster you go, the faster you go. So he's
Yes, sir. So this willingness to take risk seems to be characteristic of a certain kind of business success. But it's also like the dolphin story. Oh, the dolphins, they're the friends of humans. They guide them to shore. And the skeptic says, the dolphins guide humans in all directions, but only those who come to shore can tell the tale.
that's good. I like it.
So,
Sounds true.
yeah. So they basically were better organized and had a more accurate view of how this business would evolve. And an important element, an absolutely fundamental element, was the U.S. market. Because once Japan market was satisfied, was filled up with product, they weren't just going to say, well, it's been fun. Where shall we retire to? Instead, Mr. Kawashima was sent to the U.S. to build a dealer network there, to make arrangements. And in the early discussions with American experts, they said the U.S. market is approximately 60,000 motorcycles a year. What did you have in mind? Well, we were thinking 7,500. Well, that's very good. 7,500 a year. Let's see. No, not 7,500 a year. 7,500 a month. So while products aimed at the U.S. market were being developed, the U.S. market was being prepared. Dealers were being signed up. Arrangements for shipping and so forth were being written. It all took a tremendous amount of organization. And what does this have to do with the fun of motorcycling? Well, it's just part of the story, that's all. And if you don't like it, you don't have to listen. But I found it fascinating. Each time in preparing for one of these podcasts, I have delved into a certain area. I have learned so much. And what has jumped out at me from the pages of blah blah is stories. And I like the notion that Mr. Kawashima was hired straight out of college. At age 34, he was elevated to the board of directors, and he became the second president of Honda Motor upon the retirement of the old man. So this thing was a rocket ship, and there was an element of accident in it. Nobody said, pay that money for those machine tools right now or we're shutting you down. Nobody said that. Well, was that because they'd been carefully coddled? taken to dinner, treated in a friendly fashion. We don't know the whole story, but it worked out. And they hired lots and lots of people. They made a policy of hiring graduates from engineering school and putting them straight into difficult and challenging projects. At other companies I could name, the concept was, well, we hire them out of a high school drafting course. If they've done well there, they'll do well with us. And after 10 years of drawing updates on our many parts in production, they understand how we like things to be done, and we give them some little projects. Mr. Honda was greatly impressed by the fact that university graduates were uncorrupted by the way it's done. It's very easy to stick with the way it's done. Motorcycles do not have electric starters, but we're going to put electric starters on them and see how you like it. And everyone liked it, except for the stuffiest old stick in the muds. And they keep their own company anyway.
Yeah, what an era it was when electric start really started taking over, and it was always every road test of 1972 or where that whole era. It's like, it has electric start, but we're keeping the Kickstarter as a backup, and like almost never ever needed, but you got to have it. It's got to be there, or else what are we even doing?
Well, I remember asking my parents when I was a little boy, why do those cars have that hole underneath the radiator grill? That's where the crank goes if your car doesn't start. Is there a crank in that car? No, probably not.
Oh, my MG Magnet had one. I used to start it on the crank for people.
Yeah.
Tip to all y'all out there who are going to go find a crank start car is don't hook your thumb over the crank. Get open, hook it with your finger, like this, with your thumb tucked, because if it kicks back, it'll possibly remove your thumb or make it hurt quite a bit.
Quite a bit.
The thing about crank starting a car versus a single like a Velocette, cheers, is you have 4 opportunities. That's why you don't have to make it such a rigmarole. One of those 4 cylinders is really close to being in the right position to start when you put your effort into it. Whereas on a single, like Kevin was talking about, you got to kick it through, make the oil come in, put the cap back on, get it up to compression, move it just past compression, because then it's in the best possible position to swing around and get the charge in, and you have that one cylinder waiting to light off. There was a guy in Jerome, Arizona. There was this kind of junkyard indoor outdoor museum, mostly outdoor. He had a running Westinghouse. I think it was a Westinghouse gigantic stationary engine for a power station. And he would fire that up. It started on compressed air, and then it had short little stub stacks. I mean, I'm sure it had some other setup before he got his hands on it, but he was a noisemaker, and he would fire that thing up and start it on air and make blatting noises. He had a huge riding saw. It was one of the only places within 1,000 miles that could process huge lumber, where you put the log on the carriage and it moves through the saw. Yeah. It was really something. This story ends with a crank start dirt track Buick. I think it was a straight 8 Buick flat track racing car. And it had relatively low compression. And he was, wowing all of us up there touring his museum with how he would start that car on the crank, and then he would kill it and he would start it again. And I'm like, dude, I can start a Velocette, man. You got 8 chances and your compression's like 6 to 1. I mean, I'm impressed. Don't get me wrong, but.
Well, they crank started that, the Beast of Turin.
Oh, yeah.
What was it, 21 liters?
Yeah.
A Fiat 4-cylinder. That's
legendary. We'll give a shout out to Goodwood for always doing the good video. And if you've never been to Goodwood Revival and all that stuff, you got to, if you like old stuff, you got to go, because it's a vibe that is unequaled. It's epic. But they, You can find the beast to turn all over the interwebs. It's pretty wonderful.
Because the engine stroke is so long, the driver cannot really see over the hood. It is a monster, and it has short stub stacks that barely make it through the engine cover. They're just sticking out, and when it starts, flame shoots out of each stack. It's quite marvelous. Well, this Honda affair, of course, when everyone had met the nicest people on a Honda and sales were going marvelously, there was a glitch for a time. And their market research showed that, well, you guys haven't been keeping up with what everyone else is doing. People want brighter colors. They want a new look. Oh, sure, okay. And that was done, and it fixed it. But Edward Turner, after his 1960 trip to Japan, in which he discovered, we can never catch up. That's it. We're finished. He sent his report around to the other manufacturers, and they probably didn't read it. And they couldn't do anything anyway because there was no one about to borrow $1 million to buy machine tools because the stockholders would not have it. What do you mean $1 million in new machine tools? There was no one there who was saying, yes, but in 5 years, this will mean this capability to produce this many machines. And if we design the correct ones, such as C100 step through 50cc, we'll be riding high. They built 300,000 CB350s, or very close to it.
Remarkable.
And of course, as of 2017, 100 million C100s were built. The most produced motor vehicle in the history of the earth. So, from the tiny seed, the mighty oak doth spring. And Honda actually was not a tiny seed. He was quite substantial, and so was his partner, Fujisawa. And between the two of them, they licked the platter clean and continue to do so in absentia.
It's amazing, or it's remarkable what you said earlier about Honda wanting to stick with the two-stroke.
Yeah.
Because his later reputation, probably from that lesson, his later reputation was, I don't really like two-strokes. And he was definitely not a turbo guy. He didn't seem to want to have anything to do with turbos. That was the reputation from talking with folks at Honda. When I was first in the business in the 90s, talking to PR and development guys, and you saw them working in Grand Prix racing, trying to make oval pistons and lots of valves work. And then finally,
after not winning 1 point in the Grand Prix race, they parked that bike and replaced it with NS3. Freddie won 2 races on it in 1982. When it was introduced, it had 108 horsepower. The competition had 130. And in 1983, Freddie was world champion. And basically, Freddie's bike wasn't so abusive of its tires. And Freddie was able to win races because the other people tore their tires to pieces. In 1982, he won at Spa in Belgium, which is the high-speed racetrack. That's where the Moto Guzzi was timed, the V8, at 178 miles an hour. The race came back to Freddie. The fellows went streaking away, and when their tires got tired after 10 laps or so, they were his. And that bike had a 2-year life. After that, it was 4 cylinders. And Of course, they tried hard with the NR four-stroke. Mr. Honda did not like to avoid a challenge. He decided in the late 60s that he would build air-cooled automobiles and people would like it. The car, the 1300, received excellent reviews from an obedient journalism. But the background was his engineers were going nuts because of the flood of change orders that was coming to the production line. Oh, we have to do this a little bit differently. Oh, we're substituting this part from this part number onward. Well, I don't know how we're going to fix this, but rest assured, in a week or two, we'll have it. Finally, a busload of engineers went to see Mr. Honda, and they said, please do not destroy the company in this way. We like working here. We enjoy the work and the challenge, but we believe this car is a mistake. And it's described as a mild response. Who knows if that's accurate, but it's described as a mild response. He said, okay, that's what we'll do. And what project was waiting to replace it, just as Honda's three-cylinder two-stroke was waiting to replace the four-stroke oval piston NR500? The Honda Civic. And it took the world by storm because instead of waiting for the engine to make a mess and push it out the exhaust port and then trying to clean it up, they went at improving the combustion process so that not as much polluting material was produced in the first place. And this was an approach that did not have an indefinite future, but it was a wonderful example of a new company with new ideas coming up with new solutions. So this was why Mr. Honda wanted to hire lots of young graduates, because he felt that a fresh look can be better than years of staring.
Compound vortex controlled combustion, CVCC. Yes. Whipping it around and making it burn very thoroughly and making it, as you said, clean
combustion, not just clean exhaust.
Yeah. It's pretty cool. I think of over the years of Honda's engineering mindset, you were talking about Honda observing that the 250s were going nearly as fast as the 500s. And I always think of that at the time of the NSR 500V, where they were looking at the rules and the weight limitations and saying like, hey, you know what, with this twin cylinder 500, like Freddie's three-cylinder, lighter, maybe we have something. And they played with it for a while. It wasn't unsuccessful.
It turned out that the line that it had to take through a corner was a corner speed line because it couldn't accelerate as hard as the V4s. But if it could get off the grid first, it could, for a time, lead the race until its tires began to say, I have some misgivings about this. I'm not sure I'm going to continue.
Formula USA back in the day, I was covering that when I was at Cycle News. I went out to Willow Springs and I was covering Rich Oliver versus Chuck Graves. And of course, Chuck does Graves Motorsports, and he was a highly successful racer at Willow Springs. And there's Formula USA, and Formula USA, you could do whatever. You could put, I believe Chuck, certainly one of the races I was covering, he had a GSXR 750 with a 900. I think it was an RF 900 engine in it. Mm-hmm. So making big juice, a lot of power in a nice light. GSXR 750s of the era were quite light. And then he would race against Rich Oliver on a 250 Grand Prix twin. And it's exactly what you said. So Rich couldn't get off the line. And I watched him, Chuck gets off the line because he's got a 1000cc of hopped up flame throwing 4-stroke, and he can get out of there. And then Rich is riding a different line. He catches up, but he's riding a different line, and it's really hard for him to pass. But because the bigger, heavier bike has got all that power, especially at Willow where you're just smoking the right side of your tire, Rich could be like, if I could just squirt, he said this to me, if I could just squirt by, man, I can leave him,
Yeah.
because he can ride his line, because he's being, they're intersecting, right?
They're intersecting. That's it.
They're intersecting, and he can't do what he needs to do. But I think it was a second race. Rich got out there and he made that pass. He took the flyer and he got out in front, and he was able to go just because his tires would last the whole race.
Yeah. Well, in current MotoGP, Fabio Quartararo on the Yamaha is somewhat down on power. The bike has to be ridden in a corner speed style because it is engineered for that. He often complains of this intersecting lines thing, and the fact that if he has to drag race a point and shoot bike off the corner, the point and shoot bike always wins. And he says all these things in a very even manner, as if I'm really not investing my ego in this operation here because it's been like this for a long time and I've got used to it. The poor man. Racers don't like to be last.
Yeah.
So this other story, of course, is really a story about manufacturing, that Honda was able to overcome their Japanese competitors by lowering their manufacturing costs until the others could no longer compete. And in business, there's no such thing as slowing down to make a race of it. You crush them. And 10 in 1 year, not bad. So then there came the era of marketing and of applying the Alfred E. Sloan theory of vehicle sales, which is start them on the Chevrolet, get them interested in an Olds or a Buick, and soon, if their income rises as you hope it will, you'll have them in the Cadillac, which has a high markup. Good business. And people who like the step through C100, whose little engine made roughly 5 horsepower at 9,500 RPM. This was Mr. Honda's understanding that RPM is the key factor in getting power from a 4-stroke. If you're not allowed to rely on the comfortable old cushion, ain't no replacement for displacement. That was the key. And now we have the Japanese majors. Some of them have left California, including Honda. I think that the U.S. market they view it as resting for a while. And they've shifted their interest to Southeast Asia, where people's incomes are rising rapidly because Southeast Asia is doing what Honda did. They're investing in high production, low parts cost machine tools. All those little countries, Thailand, Vietnam, Indonesia.
And the big one, India.
They're tooling up. And that's what it takes. So, story without end.
Yeah. Yeah, your GM progression reminded me of, I owned a Cadillac. I had owned a 64 Cadillac Eldorado. Actually, we went to lunch in it once. And,
yes, indeed.
I gave it a good squeeze to make a hole in traffic, and you just sat back laughing. We were in the top down in Newport Beach. The sun was shining. You just started laughing out loud because it was impressive. It had 485 foot-pounds of torque at something like 1,800 RPM. It was the first year, as you said earlier. There's no replacement for displacement. 420 was the first year for the 429, and they moved the accessories to the front, like the distributor to the front. They did some things that made it easier to work on. First year for the turbo hydromatic 400, legendary GM transmission.
Absolutely.
And a wonderful car. Set it and forget it climate control. First year for that. It had vacuum tubes and transistors under the dash to control this stuff. It was magnificent.
And
And
a
it was a
power
really,
trunk lid.
yep, one of the greatest cars. I've owned about 35 cars, Aston Martins and Jaguars and a lot of foreign jobs. But it was a wonderfully made car. I think for 1964, it was probably the best made car in the world because it had all of that GM. We got to build it reliably, cheaply, and in huge numbers.
Yep.
And it was very much like an Impala. All the lines and the dimensions of the car were very much like an Impala, but it was a Cadillac, and it had all the different finishes. And how did they make the engines? It was cool that the divisions had their engines.
Yes, they did.
Over at Chevrolet, making a 350, they had piston groupings of 3 weights.
Yep.
And so they would group all the pistons in, here's the A group, and they could be, it was just a wider range, making all those pistons to make the engine as balanced as it could be. And then they put it together, and it was pretty nice. Cadillac had 5 piston groupings.
Yes.
To narrow it down and make a smoother engine.
Bring it closer to the ideal.
And looking at Honda over all those years, they started with their little step through, and they smashed the world with the step through, and then they just started going up and up and up. And by the time Peter Egan started at Cycle World, circa 79, 78, we were riding CBXs, inline 6-cylinder, double overhead cam street bikes, liquid cooled GL 1000s, the first Goldwing, the first big liquid cooled motorcycle.
Remember people saying the AMA is terrified that Honda will try to homologate that thing for a superbike. The 6. Because it had little 36 millimeter fork tubes.
Yeah.
Put those on a 125 now. But the dead hand of the past is always with us. We have to be careful in our thinking. Is this actually true, or do I just believe it? So it was grand, though, for those people who wanted desperately to have a Honda 4 in 1969. They could. If they wanted a Honda 6, they could. Too much is just enough. And of course, that could be said for the Cadillac you owned, in which I laughed.
Yeah, it was a magnificent car.
Frost would come so much itself.
Yeah, and just so effortless. That was what was great about it. Peter Egan had a 63 Cadillac, and we talked about driving those cars, and they weren't sports cars, but they were very good handling cars. They were nice to drive on a winding back road. You weren't rushing things, but they were effortless. Yeah. And that squeeze was just, you just squeeze in the Carter AFB, the aluminum 4-barrel carburetor that was on it. The number of available and useful adjustments damping the closing of the throttle plates. You could just zero that thing in so wonderfully, and it just did exactly what you wanted a car to do. You just turn the key, starts, idles, settles, idles high, settles in as the choke goes. It was what a thing. And it's remarkable at thinking back to 1964 at how backward and basic motorcycles were by comparison.
Yes, they were. And today they have all those features. You start, there's a high idle. The engine does not stumble. It doesn't ask you, please fiddle with the choke. I'm dying. No, it just sits there, dum, dum, dum. And over the seconds, as the seconds pass and the intake tracts on the cylinder head warm up, more of the fuel evaporates, the mixture becomes rich, and the fuel injectors inject less fuel in proportion so that it always seems civilized, smooth, and very satisfying.
Yeah, new Goldwings are, are out of this world. It is Cadillac of motorcycling. It really is.
I don't at all miss bent choke arm to match this contour, and you're looking at this little tiny writing on this little thing that came with your carburetor rebuild kit. Inevitably, a tiny O-ring or a little steel ball drops on the floor, rolls off the bench. Where did it go? They're calling me to lunch. Okay, I better go eat because I'm going to need fuel to keep working on this stupid technology. All gone now.
Yeah.
So much better.
Sensors. Well, some of us venture off into the past for entertainment value.
Well, it does have entertainment value, and it would be nice to go back and fix some of those choke pull-off problems and actually understand them. But I had to go to lunch.
Yeah, I was, back in the day, I thought of myself as motorcycling was purely an athletic pursuit for me. All I wanted to do was go faster. All I envisioned was looking at photos in Cycle World magazine before I worked there and saying, that should be me, looking at Freddie Spencer in 1983 and 1985. I could do that. Yeah, I just need a chance, and I can do that, and I want to go do that. Riding, we have a V4, a Ducati V4S, Panigale V4S here. Riding them 1000s, that at this point in life, it is so much motorcycle. They're just supernatural and wonderful. But I have to say, if I'm going road racing, I'm taking the nostalgic route. I'm going vintage racing and getting maybe not a CB350. They're popular, but something with a little more displacement to, carry me down the road with corner exit torque.
You stood up for emphasis.
Yes. Well, that's it, folks. Thanks for listening. We appreciate your support. Share it with your friends if you think they'd like it. This was the evolution of Honda Twins and into the future we have seen. Check us out in comments, and we'll see you on the next podcast. Thanks for listening.